Yo, what's up, guys? Um, Today we're going to talk about synthesizing hi-hats. To add this to our fundamentals of drum synthesis series. I feel like this one's been a little bit of a long time coming, but I wanted to think of some creative ways, or give you some potentially creative options to synthesizing these things. Um, these like all these other videos. These are all techniques that I use. So Sigjir tested and approved. Although I won't take credit for any of these. I don't think anyone is originating any of these techniques at this point in time. So let's listen to an example of a beat. And I do want to preface this by saying that this is purely synthesized. The kick and snare are just serums. I will go a bit in depth into the plugins that I like using, the synths themselves, and some of the post processing on the hats and the cymbals. But let's take a listen. So there's tons of ways to go about doing this, and I would like to show you kind of some of the foundational concepts, and then once you kind of know the rules, let's call them, for clean cymbals, meaning things that don't interfere with other transients or mess up the grand scheme of the mix. Um, you can really go off and do whatever you want and get a result that either you wanted in the first place, or maybe you turned a knob accidentally and it took you down some other path and that got you to somewhere just as pleasing. So we have a copy of this drum rack here, and just to show you, there's only a kick and snare set up right now. There's really not a lot of post processing going on. Some saturation, some multiband upwards compression on the sides, compressor, clipper, just to control everything. This is usually more or less my drum group chain mix. So if I was to start writing a track and eventually I'd get to like the mix down, mastering, or final mix down point, this is usually what I'm working with, and I'm kind of tweaking this as we go in the context of a song. But this isn't about that. So if we look at our MIDI, it is the same MIDI as this other drum machine. We're gonna kind of just recreate some of the symbols that should be here. So the way I've deconstructed this is we have a hi-hat that's hitting on, I believe that would be a quarter note. Yeah, quarter note. So we have like these quarter note hi-hats coming in here that are really just going to sound like accents or emphasis on like the half bar. So I'm going to restart that point and edit that out. Okay. So, all right, if we take a look at our MIDI here on this beat, these D1, D sharp 1, E1, G1, those are the MIDI triggers, so we will tune those. We're not actually playing those notes. That's just the MIDI trigger for the drum sound that we're going to use. The way I set this up, D1 will sort of act as this quarter note, or I guess it'll act as a quarter note hi-hat. It's probably going to, in this case, it's going to be hitting every twice every bar, so it's kind of like a half note thing. D sharp 1 would be a quicker eighth note. Let's call it backwards hi-hat. So you might have a hard down stroke onto the hi-hat, and then maybe a softer kind of, not upstroke, but if we're thinking about like a real drummer, every hit isn't the same hard hit on the surface of that piece of the kit. So this might be kind of like a softer groove carrying sort of hit. This E1, this is actually one long MIDI note. This will be like a 16th note shaker or something like that. And then this G1 is sort of just like a crash cymbal for variation or tension release, depending on what you want to do. But yeah, so let's get started, and we'll kind of work through this process, and I'll sort of just show you what I would do is, if I were to just start creating these from scratch. I don't really have a vision or a goal in mind of what I want these drums to look like. So I'm going to just kind of give you my approach to doing this. So we'll start with D1. That's going to be our emphasis hi-hat. One of the plugins that I really like using right now, and it's a Bitwig stock plugin. So if you're not in Bitwig, unfortunately, you'll have to find another option. It's called Phase 4. It is just a phase modulation synthesizer with 4 oscillators. There's also an FM4, which is frequency modulation. There is a difference between those two things. Sometimes that gets mixed up a bit. Like in the original Serum, FM was actually, I guess, what they're calling phase distortion now, which is phase modulation. This particular synth, it's not really better or worse than any other synth. I just really like the resolution of the synth itself. It's really easy to get sounds out of, and in terms of like workflow, I feel like I can just get a good result pretty quickly. So just to give you an example, okay, that's our sound. We're gonna set all of this stuff to stereo because our hats can be stereo. Why don't we just turn all this down? It's not actually doing anything. So right now, it kind of helps to, you want to use like a waveform that has a lot of harmonics in it. So like a saw wave, or square waves are also pretty good. That would be our pulse, or pulse width. And if I believe I can just display this whole thing. Yeah, so this red window right here is kind of the wave that we're working with. So that actually will sound pretty good in the end, and I'm just kind of used to listening for this stuff. The filter here doesn't matter. I'm sort of just using it to, protect the integrity of the cymbal down the road. I know that my cymbal's not going to have anything below, say, 500 hertz, so I'll probably go back and cut more lows out, but we definitely don't need any 182 hertz and below for a hi-hat. So then we have our envelope here, which we can just turn all of this down. Oops, sorry, wrong one. Our amp envelope. So why don't we go ahead and okay. And then one quick note that I wanted to address here is the attack. Obviously, we have, if our attack is at 0 milliseconds, we have that click, or that sharp transient. you don't want to have a super crisp, clean transient necessarily all the time when it comes to cymbals with drums, especially things that are going to be layered onto a kick or a snare. So this isn't a rule, but it's something that, just be mindful of because it could harm your mix in the long run. When you're using these stereo signals and they are, um, they're changing over time, so it's not the same exact thing every time. If you're layering a hi-hat on top of a kick, for instance, that stereo transient of the hi-hat could hit at the same time as the mono transient of the kick, and it could phase cancel or shift or just move things, and you could end up losing some of that transient or that punch along the way. So something to be mindful of. I usually just give the synth a little bit of attack. You don't need a lot, like it's not a pad, but 20 milliseconds is probably more than enough to make space for those kick transients or those snare transients. Okay, so we've done that. The next thing I'm going to do is, just to make it stereo, we're going to just shift it a little bit. And then I'm going to make some white noise quickly. Or not white noise, I'm going to make some noise quickly, which basically is just this sound. It's not making any noise. There we go. Because I have a low cut going on here, or a high pass going on here. Okay, so if I just phase mod this signal back into itself, it'll kind of turn into noise. And if I just kind of overload everything, it's a lot more noisy now. Same deal. We will create some stereo width to it. Okay, and let's listen to our sound now. All right, and then we can take something like a sine wave, and why don't we just shift this to a random tone? It doesn't even matter. And we'll start sending that into our oscillator 1, or this red oscillator. Maybe we can change the waveform. Maybe a square wave. Yeah, that could work. And then from here, what I would do is start EQing and then post-processing to actually make this come alive and become a thing. But I'm assuming most of you probably want to see this in a synth that is more universal, like a third-party synth. So we're going to delete that and do everything with a Serum 2. Let's call this hat. Now the way I would do this is we're going to turn randomization down on the phase. And I find simple waveforms usually kind of get the job done best in this scenario. So maybe we use something, let's do another square. And sometimes I've actually noticed lower octaves end up sounding better because you're gonna cut those lows out anyway, so you're sort of just left with these overtones. But that's just a stylistic choice. You don't necessarily have to do that. Use something like a triangle, bring that down. Let's bump that up an octave or two. And let's do phase mod or phase distortion for now. Sometimes frequency modulation ends up working a little bit better, a little bit more atonal. That's lost. Yeah, we'll stay with the phase distortion. Okay, we're gonna add some stereo width here because it's a hat. And just to get that sound not changing every time, we're gonna lock the phase by creating just a short envelope. We are also going to add some attack to our sound. And that makes space for our other transients in the beat. Now we're gonna create a volume envelope because we need to sort of shape this metallic sound. And I'd imagine it might look something like this. I like that a lot. Okay, so then we will use a filter. We're gonna high pass. And we can just do like a 24, for instance. If you weren't aware, you can right click on these filter windows and set the frequency response and FFT option, or you can use phase response. It kind of depends on what you're doing here, but the frequency response will actually show you the frequency signal in here, just if you want a visual cue. So we will tweak this. All right, and now we're kind of starting to get a cymbal sound. One of the things that I like to do that really, well, one of the things you should be doing when you're synthesizing these things is using LFOs and envelopes and mapping them to other parameters like filter cutoff, gain, distortion amount, what, etc. You know, reverbs, mix knobs. That's gonna start to bring life into the sound. It's gonna make it less static and create more of a dynamic sound. And when I say dynamic, I'm not necessarily referring to wave dynamics, so audio dynamics. I'm talking about the sound will kind of be changing over a short period of time, which will actually bring the sound to life more because it's emulating something that would be more organic, like hitting a real hi-hat. So in this case, why don't we put a little bit of this LFO2 onto the cutoff. And okay, that sounds good to me. Yeah, that works. We're just using a bunch of voices. We did the whole stereo width thing. Let's add some noise in here because that will also give it the high frequency boost in the high frequencies that we would require here. Sometimes I like to have the noise just lag a little bit. So it doesn't need to be the same exact path as the initial metallic hit. Maybe it's something like that. And if you really want to bring this to life, you start creating imperfections in the sound. It kind of starts now it kind of starts coming alive because by having these calculated imperfections, you're mimicking a real person in a sense. As much as humans try to become almost robotic when they're playing drums, we actually like the inconsistencies or the human flaw, if you will. It's organic and it's pleasing to our ear. So in a lot of these things, we strive for perfection, realize that perfection doesn't sound as pleasing, and then you dial it back like 2% and make it a little bit more organic again. So that's a hi-hat. I would then just do some post-processing here. So let's say maybe a bit of saturation or something. Maybe even the soft clip wouldn't be a bad option here. And we'll just do another. Let's do this with an EQ actually. We'll use one EQ to kind of bypass and clean up. Same deal. If you left click on this window, you can see the frequency space. Why don't we just pull some of the highs down a bit? That works for me. And why don't we also try messing with the phase mod? Yeah. Like that a bit more. Okay, so we've got that sound, and then maybe some chorus just for some stereo effect. I would just turn all these up. We dial them back just a little bit. You do want to keep each left and right signal slightly different. So if they're the same, then what's the point of having it stereo? Cool. So something we can also do to sort of bring some character in here is using things like comb filters. So in this case, one of the filters that I really like is Serum's reverb filter. I'm going to put this before the chorus just to kind of shape the sound before, because the chorus is just giving it stereo width. But you can hear, especially when we set the cutoff of the filter to a lower frequency, it creates a lot of phasing with these notches and these peaks. And it starts to give it this metallic overtone quality, which also kind of brings our cymbal or our hi-hat to life. Oops, that's the mix knob. Let's take a listen in our drum beat, try to mix it in. Okay, cool. Yeah, that works. So that would be a hi-hat. And then I would just check my levels, and it's not super loud. I'd probably go in and clean this up afterwards. So maybe an EQ here. Let me do another low cut. And you know what? Actually, I would do one more thing in this. I would then apply, let's call it a dynamic filter. So this would be another EQ in Serum. I'd want it happening after the reverb filter, because that's more of a creative choice. It's not like an engineering choice. And then what I would do is try to pick a couple frequencies and maybe like a high shelf to boost, just to bring the sound to life a bit more. All right. And the way we would go about doing this is probably just using the same main volume LFO here on the gain knob. Cool. And then we would do a combination of these on this high shelf. This is going to kind of just brighten the sound up a bit, but we don't want it to constantly be bright. We want it to kind of only be bright in the moment that it needs to be. And then we'll also use the other LFO that we used on the noise oscillator to add some gain on the high shelf. And then if you really wanted to get this kind of moving a bit more organically too, what you could do is take an LFO and maybe, snap it off of the grid and just put it on this peak that's sort of trying to catch the transient a little bit, and we just move this over time. Cool. So now that we got that, I would probably move forward with post-processing. Would be some EQ. And if it was necessary, I'd probably use some gain control, but it looks like we're hitting at about negative 12.5 dB, so that's not really going to interfere with anything. So that would be our hat. Why don't we go ahead and instead of doing a faster hat, we'll just do a shaker, because I think that will be more, it'll show more versatility in what you can do. So for the shaker, right, this one can be even easier. It could literally just be some noise, stereo noise. I like my drum tops to be in stereo. Stereo is probably always going to sound better than mono. And then the way we're going to make this come to life, we're going to use an LFO, set it to re-trigger, and just add it to the level. That's the gain. And then what you can sort of do is draw out what you want your beat to look like. For instance, maybe we're doing something like this. Right? You don't really need it to be perfect, because that's, again, we're not trying to make perfection here. Maybe a little tail, got a little reverse swell at the end or something. And then if we hear that, that's a shaker. And then something that you can do, why don't we start with like a slower rate. Something you can do to kind of get more variation out of your patch, so you're not using 1,000 patches and tracks and bouncing things all the time. Let's just call this LFO1 rate, and we will set this macro to the rate of LFO1. That works, yeah. If you really wanted to, you could, get other rhythms like dotted notes or triplets. But I think for now that works. Maybe we just play around with some of these attacks. So we're protecting those transients. Cool. Then I would probably just take the same exact. Let's set up a. Actually, let's just do this all in the effects bus. We'll set up a filter here. This would just be a high pass filter, maybe an 18 or something. Give it a little boost there in the resonance. And then we just apply the same LFO to the cutoff. And now we're starting to get that movement that we need. We can always bring in another reverb filter, right? If we want to get that metallic overtone, or comb filter, rather. You don't really need to use the reverb. I think they just called this reverb because it can create that effect. Okay. What else could we do to this? We could, instead of using a chorus, give it a delay. Why don't we make it a ping pong delay? Well, okay, and what we would do here is, for now, let's link them. Let's turn off the BPM. And we almost want to get into these shorter, inaudible length of time. So I think, if I haven't covered this before, 10 milliseconds is kind of where the human ear, 10 milliseconds and below is kind of the range of time where the human ear can't actually hear what's happening. So when we make these, like a transient click or something like that, it's usually in like a millisecond or 2 milliseconds, because it's so fast that the ear can't discern what's happening. So in this case, like when we're talking about making space for transients and we say use an attack of 20 milliseconds or whatever, it's because you're kind of creating a gap. So if, let's say that the transient itself happens over the course of 2 milliseconds and then you create a 20 millisecond gap, well, you have really 18 milliseconds of space between transient 1 and transient 2. And that's because we can't really perceive the difference, but we can hear the result. So in this case, what I want to do to create some stereo variation with this delay is if our first delay, the left signal, is happening at a rate of 18.74 milliseconds, we're going to unlock these now and just barely shift this one a couple milliseconds off. And you can't really hear the difference, but there is a difference in the stereo field now, or in the side signal. Or actually, no, stereo, because there is also middle frequencies in here. So let's really turn this up to hear the difference. Right, there's a difference there, but when we tighten it up to a matter of milliseconds, usually anything under 10 milliseconds, you're not going to hear the difference, and then it just kind of creates this like stereo variation. So we'll mix that in, and that adds some character to it. Okay, and then we can always use an EQ again to sort of shape the sound. Oops, left click for the signal. Yeah, that's a good frequency. Kind of giving the shaker a little bit of body, which you wouldn't necessarily think you would want, because we don't want lower body in a shaker, but it's there for a very short amount of time. Again, we can't really hear it, but we can perceive it. And it kind of makes it feel like there's a little bit more weight to that shaker. So let's do the same thing with a high shelf here, just to kind of get it to brighten up a bit. Cool. So we went from this which works. I mean, that is a shaker. It might not work in the context of a mix in an entire song, but now we have this. Right? And if I check my level real quick on my shaker, which we will name shaker, so it's easier to mix in the end. It's hitting it like negative 13.5. So there's always room afterwards to compress these things and clip them and get them to sit at the dynamic range that you want them to be at. But we'll keep moving. So we have our shaker, and then let's do, what else do we have in there? Let's do it. Well, let's listen to our beat first. Okay, so I'll do a quick mix down here to sort of get these sounding a little bit more cohesive. So I won't talk, and I'll kind of just work through this. something I would do here to add some character to the hat. I think I've mentioned this before, but you can use bit crushing to kind of create some digital distortion and add some low frequencies back in, and then we'll put an EQ after it to take the frequencies that we don't need there out. So again, we're kind of shaping and then using the result. And just to make this beat work a little bit better, we're going to make these true quarter notes. And we'll just leave a little bit of a gap. Actually, no, you know what we're going to do? Do exactly what we did for the shaker, because it's a lot more dynamic that way and easier to work with, I feel. So we'll take our hi-hat, right? And in this case, we'll have to set a macro, I think. But we know it's going to be a quarter note, so that's totally fine. And we'll set this to like 20%. Yeah, because the 16th will be more than enough here. So same deal, 20% gives us about a 16th. Call this rate, and we'll set these to re-trigger. And let's listen to that. And this is just a little too metallic for me, so maybe we'll bring the mix down. Okay. And then what you could do for variation here is, if we're playing, it can get kind of a ghost note if we apply an LFO to the y-axis on this point. Okay. And then we'll have to do it on this as well, which we could probably just solve with this. And maybe on this. So we'd bring that down a bit, and we'd bring that down a bit more. Okay, so now what we're sort of doing is creating like this like fake velocity thing, and instead of actually mapping in all of these velocity notes, we're just using this LFO that's on a quarter note. You could even go a half bar if you wanted. But we're kind of using that to create a variation in the sound, so it's not just the same static hit all the time. So now we're kind of getting more variation, and you could really go down a rabbit hole with this, but I don't want to waste time kind of getting into the real specific things. Just know that that's something that you should explore, can explore, and I certainly recommend, and I know I do myself. So if we listen to this beat now, we also need to copy over our signal or our new pattern to the other 4 bars. Cool. And then, you know, good practice is save often. That way you don't lose work. Okay, last thing we will do is make a crash, which is going to be on our G1. We will also use Serum for this, or Serum 2 for this. This is the same principle, or the same concept as all these other sounds. The only difference here is that instead it's going to be a lot longer, because we're going to use it to sort of ring out, to create like a release of tension here. So what I would do is maybe take something like a triangle wave. And I'm just going to use phase mod with simple waveforms again, sine wave. Let's listen to that. Maybe even a square wave. Yep, that works. We'll make it stereo. Quick little envelope just to lock the phase of that. Turn that detune down. That works. Let's try just playing around with the tuning real quick. That might work better. Let's... Okay. All right, so we have that. So why don't we start with our volume knob again? In this case, it's just going to be a 1-hit, so everything can be in envelope mode. It's kind of taking up like a half of a bar here, so... Maybe we'll mess around with the filter cutoff. Cool. And we need to add our noise. Probably white, maybe pink. All right, and then we'll do something like this. All right, then we'll take this to the effects bus. Maybe a little saturation. Some filtering. Well, actually, why don't we use something like a hyperdimension for stereo width. Okay, then we will use our filter. Why don't we do something this polar and then we will just kind of EQ and clean this sound up a bit. Not a fan. That's okay. All right, so then we will just clean up this sound. And maybe on this guy, let's see. Okay, and all right. And then let's see. What's a bar? Cool. So let's hear our beat now. I'm gonna say that needs a little bit of attack. Let's see what the problem oscillator is. Okay. Cool. All right. So for this one, we probably don't need to correct a lot because it's pretty simple. Maybe we just double check those lows, or the mids rather. That works. What's our level on that? Same deal, not very loud. That is going to be called our crash. Now, the next point that I want to get into here is some post-processing or like bus processing. And in this case, I'm using this effects layer. You could sort of treat this as a group or like an effects end or something. I have a dry signal here. It's just the dry drum signal. I'm then going to set up this group here, and I'm calling it cymbals because I'm going to send an audio signal into each one and then process that group in a way. So we will grab the audio signal from the hat, the audio signal from the shaker, and the crash. And now we should be getting okay, so now that we have like a cymbal bus or a cymbal group set up here on this layer, we're going to add some convolution to get it all sounding like it's sitting in the same space. I'm really just shaping the sound here to sound good in the context of the beat. Okay, and then just to protect those transients from the kick and the snare, I will sidechain some stuff real quick. And this is just where Shaper Box comes in and shines. So we will grab our kick signal and our snare signal. And take a look. So cool. Now let's take a listen. Also, I forgot to mention that we should be EQing the convolution because it's going to have signals in there that we might not necessarily want. Maybe we change that. That's not terrible. Okay, so we'll leave that up there. That's fine. Then let's do some dynamics processing here. So something you can do is use a really fast compressor. That's all this is a compressor. And we're actually gonna try to glue this sound together a little bit more. And we're gonna do that by actually using a low threshold, which is, when you think about a compressor, the compressor will take the peaks of the signal and bring them down to a certain point, depending on how you set the compressor. There's also upwards compression, which will make things more quiet, sound more loud, and that's what we're aiming to do right here. So we're going to take this low threshold and we're going to start making silence not exist. We're going to take the quietest part and make it louder, and it'll kind of squash the signal and glue it into like this wall of sound. All right, so now let's hear that in the context of our beat. Cool. Okay, so that would be our beat. You could then go and even work on top of that, and then let's say the kick and the snare should exist in a space. When you think about recording drums with a drum set and you have these microphones and you are capturing the room and the sound of the room and the sound of everything, all the kit pieces interacting with the room. So something we can do is use like a room convolution, for instance. And honestly, what I would probably do to keep this safe is create another effects layer and just have a dry signal. We'll call this the dry signal, right? That's the sound we were working with. And then we have our convolution signal. And then I would just do some things here to like protect the integrity of the mix, like cut the lows out from the kick. And why don't we just go ahead and copy the sidechain from the cymbals and add that to our reverb or our convolution. So you should see now we're just carving out that space for the transient again. And then we get this. There's a particular frequency in here that I'm not fond of. Might just be on my kick signal. Well, without going down that rabbit hole, you can now hear, the difference with our convolution or our cymbal processing. And then with, even further gluing and you could keep it expanding on this as much as needed. And then if you're someone that wants to work with drums and audio, you bounce this out and process it further and move on and keep doing things. That's how I go about synthesizing cymbals. I hope you find this helpful. I will leave the presets to these cymbals up on my Gumroad. They'll be free. I think educational assets should always be something that you shouldn't have to pay for. And yeah, you can grab those the presets, the Serum presets, and I will bounce versions. So you have samples if you don't have access to Serum. Although you could recreate this in any synth that's not specific to Serum, as you saw. I prefer to actually use that phase 4 synth, Vital, phase plant, anything will do. So yeah, if you have questions or need me to expand on points, or you feel like I kind of lost the plot and rambled a bit, let me know in the comments or shoot me a DM. And if you want me to discuss anything in particular for like another video, another subject matter, let me know. I'm doing these to help you guys out. And it's nice to hear myself talk, I suppose. But yeah, really, these are to be an educational asset for people on YouTube looking for information on this stuff. See ya.